Writers, readers, drinkers, lend me your ears and your livers. Welcome to Writers Drinking Whiskey Open Bar, the show where we talk unironically about truth and beauty and ironically about everything else. I am your host, William R. Hincy, and joining me today, I have a lovely panel of authors and editors. Dario Chariello, Gaby Loreno, welcome to Whiskey Bar.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Awesome. And in the theme of the show, for anyone watching for the first time that hasn't got to experience you guys before, I will link up your individual shows to it, and then down there in the description we'll have your full bios. But I like to have some fun with the descriptions. So today I was thinking we're going to do a Tinder themed swipe left or right, and I had to look this up because Tinder did miss me by a little bit. Swiping left is you're passing on it. And swiping right means, like, I guess you're scoring, right? Like you like that person or you like that thing. Left is the bad. So I'll give you three things you can swipe left or right on, and then we'll go from there. So maybe, Gaby, we can start with you.
Sure.
So here's your choices here. Swipe left or right. Writing that sounds like writing. The next one will be abundant use of exclamation points. And then the last one is sweet potatoes.
Swipe left on the first two, swipe right on the third.
Sorry. Okay. So you're passing on writing that sounds like writing, abundant use of exclamation points, and you are going with sweet potatoes.
I'm gonna have to choose the sweet potatoes. There's so many things you can do.
Right. I think sweet potatoes are an abomination. That's why I put that one in there. But you know where I'm swiping with that one. But Dario, how about you?
I'm going to use the scroll wheel for the first one, which is the what was the first one again?
Writing that sounds like writing.
That's it. Yeah, it all depends how it's done.
Right.
It really depends on whether the person has a good grip on style. I'm a stylist, so I have no issue with that, and sometimes I like it. What was the second? I'm sorry, I've got a short memory today.
No worries. Abundant use of exclamation points.
Oh yeah, generally swipe left and swipe right on sweet potatoes.
So I'm the only one like swiping away sweet potatoes. My family knows this. Around Thanksgiving, they're like, we can't have, like, we want sweet potatoes. I'm like, no, sweet potatoes. Regular potatoes were perfect as is. Don't make them sweet. And I think the first.
You don't like them with balsamic vinegar? There's so many things you can do with a sweet potato.
You know what it is? I forget who I had. Actually, it was this month's episode. Michael Branch was the author, and then he described it very much to how I feel. It was, my palate tends toward the spicy versus the sweet. I don't like sweet things much, so I like my drinks. So I like to taste the liquor and stuff, even though it's a little harsh or a little spicy. I like that versus sweet. So there's probably just that this whole sweet potato, and I'm just, the Irish part of me feels offended. That we've done this to the mighty potato.
An abomination.
Abomination. Exactly. Awesome. So thanks for that. So let's get to the first question of today. So round one, and this will be writing craft basically. So what makes an effective story opening? So what must an opening do? What are some techniques, methods you can employ to get that done? So maybe then we started with Gaby for the Tinder game. So Dario, we can start with you here.
Well, I always say you have to open with questions. You've got to generate questions in the reader's mind, because that's usually the main thing that's going to keep them turning the pages. Not only that, but you have to keep that up throughout the manuscript. But some of the worst advice is open with action, because unless you really get it, it's empty. You can open with all the action you like, but if you don't care for the character, which is one of my soapboxes, it ain't going to work. I don't care about action with unknowns in it.
Sure.
So opening with a question, I think, or generating one within the first few paragraphs, and And coupling that with an interesting voice, whether it's a narrative voice or a character voice. I don't usually open with dialogue. I mean, that can work too, but the main thing is to generate some questions in the reader's mind that they want the answers to, and keep generating more questions as that you solve the first ones or address the first one. So I'd keep it that simple. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be action-packed. I mean, it can be. But I think that's really what carries a story.
Sure. I love how I love thinking about it that way, because you'll hear people say like there's like the setup, right? There's setup, and then like Act 2, your Act 3, you start the actual delivery of those. But setup, I mean, it makes sense to the mind, but I think questions are very easy to understand, right? Like this is a question, and now naturally we want it to be answered. And then that payoff, when you say it the other way, is actually just the answer to the questions you've put out there. So interesting.
And the setup itself, the setup itself can contain and generate questions. I mean, everything can. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of getting them to keep reading.
Mm-hmm. All right, Gaby, you want to take it from there?
Sure. So I tend to be a little more character focused with my own writing, but I've gotten so much feedback over the years that you have to start with action. And the only way I can do that is to write a whole lot and then see what I can get rid of at the front of it, so that are kind of starting with action, but you're also providing a context, and you're once you get into writing a character, you know how to express them, you know how to show their voice, you know how to show how they feel about certain things or demonstrate how they behave towards certain other stimuli in the scene. So so that was my workaround, was to just write a whole bunch of stuff, and then once you know what it is, then you can start with the strongest bit. But I am happy to hear what Dario says, because I don't always agree with that. Sometimes I like to start with a problem. Like this has been weighing on like this character. Yeah. And let's see what happens and how she addresses it. You know what I mean?
Right, sure. Well, I think the Grapes of Wrath, starts with the epic description of the Dust Bowl, right? It literally starts with weather. And there's barely any character. There's not really action, just the weather. I mean, I guess the Dust Bowl was kind of an action, but not how we typically think of characters doing an action. And that works great. I mean, Harry Potter starts with like his birthday, right? I mean, it's not wizarded away yet. He's just, happy birthday. That's what I always remember about the movies. I always fall asleep. Actually, it's my bedtime movie. The kids know it. They're like, oh, let's watch Harry Potter. I'm like, okay, good. Let me get comfortable because I'm going to fall asleep. But it starts with his birthday. So I think it can be, starting, there's just so many ways to do it, right? And that's what you always come back to with these episodes is any rule. I mean, it's like it always depends, right? It's always kind of the catch-all for it. But I think action can work, but there's a lot of other things that can't, right? Generating questions, I think, is certainly something that can. What were you saying, Dario?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And it depends is my watchword. What Gaby says is true too. I mean, character, the questions can be generated by anything, by the setup, by the character. Why are they doing this? Why are they thinking that? What's happening to make them be running down an alley in the dark? But character in motion is opening with action. That's action itself. People think they're very blinkered. They think of action as a fight or overt conflict, but a character in motion is an action beginning. And when you're getting to the level of writers like Steinbeck, you mentioned the Grapes of Wrath, then voice can carry it. Voice alone can carry an opening. There are a few of my favorite writers who can just give you 3 pages or 10 pages of exposition at the beginning of a book, but the narrative voice is so compelling and the material itself is interesting enough that works. It's
Sure.
really, it's so much to do with the skill of the writer. But yes, I mean, I'm totally with Gaby on the character part.
Right. And how literal do we take when people say start with action? Like, are we literally like, that's the first sentence, that's within the first 10 pages? Like what, like, that's the one I have always heard. I'm like, how literally are we taking this? That first paragraph, you need to be like moving, or is it just, I don't know that might be just a unanswerable question. I don't know what the masses are saying about it, but that's what I've always thought about it.
I think most people take it as being within the first 3 or 4 paragraphs. Mm-hmm. And I see best-selling thrillers. There was one featured on NPR a few weeks ago, which made me claw the walls, because it just begins with non-stop action, and it's not necessary. It can work, but it's just so not necessary. Sure. When I have someone I don't care about, I don't give a damn what the threat is. So there's a lot of tropes come into it there. If you have, and I think this was the example I'm talking about, you have a single woman, a single mom alone with her children at home, and suddenly she realizes someone's in the house. Yeah, that's powerful. It's also fucking manipulative, and I hate it. It's cheap, right. It's easy, and yet this is, I'm not, in some ways, I'm not the best person to ask, because I don't, I'm not looking to find an agent. I'm not looking to be a bestseller. I want to write a good book. And I don't like manipulative tropes to be the main focus. That makes sense?
Well, yeah, that makes sense. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, right? I think there's a little bit of a misnomer that, just do these tropes and twist something a little and then you're a bestseller, and it's just there's certainly formulas that people use, but there's not a formula that just works and then i.e. you become bestseller. And if you pick up the bestseller list, you'll see a ton of different ways that those books get on there. I mean, you just look at the list, right? Like right now it's very fantasy heavy, the last I saw it. But you'll have thrillers on there, you'll have general fiction, whatever you want to call it. The genres will mix, and the way people go about, setting that up. I think the big thing is you have to give someone something to care about. I think, especially in school, they really used to stress that first line. What was Hemingway's first line? What was his first line? I think, if someone picks up your book, I've never picked up a book, held it long enough to open it and start reading it and went, I read one sentence and I'm not hooked and I'm putting this down, right? Like, you're there, you're going to read a little bit. You probably have a page, so that hook, I think you can do that. It doesn't need to be that first sentence or not, but you do need to give them something to care about one way or the other. And I think character is a great way to do it. I think voice can go, really far. I always think about writing. I think there's a bit of a film. People have taken too much film writing thoughts onto literature, I think sometimes, and don't realize, you have a book, you can have a great voice to it. And that voice can give you some exposition that doesn't feel like a data dump, right? It'd be really entertaining to read that. And that can capture you through. It's just, if you're doing that, you need to do it in a way that's entertaining. I had on Keir Graff, and he had a teacher that told him, and he didn't even know what it meant at the time. She's like, this is a mimetic fallacy. And he's like, what's that? She's like, when you're describing something boring and you describe it in a boring way. So if you need to describe this thing, describe it in a way that's fun, and I think that's, his episode hasn't came out as the time we're recording this, but I think that's what I titled it, is not a mimetic fallacy, but I think that's true. It's like, sometimes it's a book, you have these words, you have someone following along with what you're doing. If you describe something in a way that's really interesting, they'll follow along with you. I mean, I know we all have Twitter attention spans now. But you have the book, and if those tweets are really interesting, yeah, you'll keep scrolling, right? That you described it really interesting. You're going to keep reading that book, and keep going. And I think most readers have better attention spans anyway. So they picked up that 500-page book. They want to read it. I mean, I have a stack here of things I want to read, and then when I pick them up and actually start reading them, I want to finish. In fact, I like a lot of us, you feel very depressed when you don't finish, right? Like, it's like I should put books down, but I'm like, no, I've started this. I need to like finish
really,
this.
That never bothers me. I am so okay with putting a book down. I know that bothers me. That bothers a lot of people. I've heard there's this guilt about not finishing books.
Well, I think it's the guilt of not finishing. Right? It's like I started this. I need to finish
read
this.
bad books.
That's certainly true.
Yeah, I do read them fast. If I've decided it's bad, I will get through that 200 pages in record time. I'm usually a very slow reader, and I will push through very quickly. But yeah, I think there's the and I've heard. I wish I could attribute some of this. You hear things and I kind of forget who said it, but there's some writing advice I heard that was like, always stop kind of mid-sentence, or in the middle of a paragraph or something. And there's some brain science behind it, is that the brain hates unfinished business. So your subconscious mind keeps thinking about that. So it's harder to start from the new chapter than it is to start from like the middle of a sentence, that previous one. And so it makes sense to do it. And I think that's partially, it's like, oh, I haven't finished this. And my brain keeps going, you haven't finished that. That's unfinished business. Yeah, that's unfinished business. You need to go do that thing. So I have horrible qualities, Dario. You know this. It's What do you guys think about some of the general writing rules? I'm going to use lots of air quotes today, and they're all going to be super aggressive like this. Thank you everyone. That's our, if anyone's watching this, you drink whenever you see aggressive air quotes. But some of the writing rules, like never start with whether, although I just use Steinbeck as an example, but you hear some of these like never start with whether. What do you guys think about that kind of generally? I know there's exceptions if we all would throw grace or wrath in there, but what do you think about that more as a general rule?
I'll go first. I pretty much came up with like, if it adds to the mood and it's important to the story, then why not? I think there's a big emphasis, and you guys went into it already, about like, you've got to grab them right away. You got to really kick ass on your first 5 pages, and just they can't tear themselves away from your story. And I think it's kind of this aggressive, I'm gonna write a bestseller energy.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Maybe that's not what you're really good at writing. And maybe starting with the weather isn't the worst thing in the world. I saw a book that started with a description of a building, and it was very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm. Well, and going back to the fantasy a bit, right? Like, fantasy is all about that world building and introducing people to this whole world. And so it requires a lot of setting description, right? Like Tolkien, and it's, I had a hard time sometimes with Lord of the Rings, because sometimes it's so long. I mean, he's so brilliant doing it, but sometimes it's so, it's so long. And I was trying to read this I think at 17. So I was also, in the caffeinated mindset anyways, that I need to be moving, doing stuff. But it's so popular, and it requires so much on setting it up. So I think sometimes, like they'll say, start with dialogue or something, right? That could be okay. I'll do that commonly with chapters and things, but it's almost always like a short point of it, like a little line to kind of get your, like, that's introducing that the chapter is, what's happening. And then it kind of settles in and lets you know who's that's coming from, where they are in the world, like what's happening. Because when it's just dialogue and without understanding who, maybe the character right away, right? Maybe it's just that little sed tag or whatever. But knowing where people are, even if it's just a little flourish, that 1-2 sentence of what they are, kind of where they are in the world, that little place setting, I think can make it more plausible for the person reading it. And then also just lets you feel like you're there with them a little bit, that they're not in a white space, out in your brain. And then, like right now on the screen, right, we're all floating in this blackness. But if you actually described it, then hey, you guys have books behind you. I think Daria looks like some DVDs, maybe. I can't quite tell, but I have bottles behind me, right? That setting of it kind of like sets it up a little bit more versus just like a face floating in the ether or all with saying things. So
yeah.
What do you guys think about like hooks in general? Like what, people always say hook. I'm not even sure I always know exactly what the hook is besides like Captain, that's what inspired the opening of the show. I was going open bar because I'm a pirate. I'm channeling Captain Hook. Exactly.
Well, the hook is that question right there. The big question. It's a big question. I mean, I'm just to touch on the weather, I'm totally with Gaby. When it sets the atmosphere, when it's atmospheric and if it's well written, why not? Nothing. Another silly rule. It's okay to open with weather. It was a dark and stormy night after all. But the hook is the big question. One of the best examples of this is Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep. The first paragraph of The Big Sleep is Philip Marlowe, because it's written first person, describing how I think the first line is there was a look of rain in the foothills, and he talks about starting with weather, opening with weather, one of the most famous short novellas ever written, and there's a few paragraphs of maybe not paragraph sentences. There's maybe 4 sentences of descriptive material, and the rhythm's almost repetitive. It kind of almost lulls you. And so he's wearing this suit. There's a look of rain in the foothills. He's got the setting there. He's got a character and how he's dressed. He gives us something else, and then he says, I was calling on $4 million, which in the 30s or 40s was a hell of a lot of money. And that's the hook. That's the hook right there.
Right.
So it's a big question that makes you want an answer.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant way to look at it. I think that's brilliant too. Is sometimes I think we, I forget where what I was reading, but they're like, it was like Twitter or something when I was on. Like, I go on maybe 10 minutes at most. Most of the time I don't go on at all, but I'll go post about the show or something, right? And there will be the 3 or 4 things on the top. And usually if it's like something you guys have posted, I try to just make sure I like it or repost it or whatever. And then otherwise it'll just be whatever's there. And someone was like, oh, what are those books, that you feel like they're flawed, but then they stick with you. And it kind of got me thinking, it's like, it's probably because they're not flawed. It might just be because they're just a little off of what you're expecting. And that little bit of off, your brain gnaws on it because it wants to, we want to fit things in boxes. We like things categorized and boxed and everything. And that being just a little bit off is actually the magic of it, right? So that's starting with that weather, that's actually the magic of it. It lulls you into that. And then it hits you, with something else. So those changing tones and changing, rhythms and things are all things authors can do to kind of get those, get that impact on the reader. And I think the misguided notion is to treat it like Twitter, right? To tweet it like a stream. I just need to get someone's attention every time. 160 characters is all I have. Get their attention, versus kind of letting them get comfortable for a second, lulling them in, and then getting their attention from there. So I also think it probably depends on genre a little, right? You can have a YA book and say it's this dark and stormy night, and the kids aren't going to care, depending on the age. And then the way you describe the weather. So if it's, doing it poetically, using that poetic license a little, I think can get you, can make it more than just the weather, right? It's 80 degrees, 80 degrees Fahrenheit, sunny with a few scattered clouds, right? Like it doesn't have to be a weather report.
It's kind of, it's a left field thing, isn't it? You know, if a real strong hook comes at you from left field.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, you don't see it coming exactly, right? It's just like, but I think it's almost like a great reveal for like a mystery or something. Like you don't see it coming, but once you see it, and I've heard this happen. They said that with humor too. I've heard I forget what comedian they were talking about. There's a structure to the jokes. I forget what her name was. I need to start making notes. But she was like, I don't actually think I'm very funny. But once you realize there's just a structure to jokes and to it, and part of that is that reveal. That's the punchline, right? The reveal is the joke. And part of it is the reveals work once you realize, oh, it was there all along. Like, oh, I saw that joke coming in hindsight, and now I'm laughing because that struck me as not as god awful truth, but there's some truth to it that I can like see. There's truth to the human condition I can see. The reveal is I didn't see that person was the murderer. But now these 18 things just lined up. Like now I completely see, that was there. So awesome. Anything? Let's see. Was there anything else? There was one other one I wanted to touch base on. The other writing rule that gets bandied about quite a bit is death to the prologue, right? Like there's never use a prologue. And my book I'm working on now has a prologue, so those people are going to be very anxious with me. But how do you guys feel about prologues? Maybe we start with you this time.
I'm pro prologue. I think that it kind of, without giving them anything to chew on, it kind of gives them a sense of what's the tone of this? What am I buckling myself in for as far as where am I going with the story? What's it going to be like? I think it can be very fun to read it. I think and it can be fun to write too. You want to kind of invite them in and just say through your tone, like, this is how it's going to be. This is what we're doing here, and prepare to be surprised and hopefully enchanted a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I love the note about tone too, because I think very early it is important to set there's kind of those promises you make, right? You're making a pact with the reader, writing this thing. And I think you kind of start off with one of those as the tone, and maybe that will change as the story goes, but it should change in a way that the reader follows along with. But you're making like, this is what the tone of the story is. Probably wouldn't say, I guess there's other promises you would make. I think one would be somewhat content. I don't like genre so much because I get genre is important to a degree for selling books because you know where to put them, right? Like this is the virtual bookshelf. This is the actual bookshelf. Kind of, that's how we organize the things. I don't know that people will be like, this is epic fantasy versus this is, I don't know what other, I don't even know all of them, but they'll say these. I don't think most readers know exactly all of these things. I'm sure there's some, but there's most people, it doesn't mean anything. But I think if you're telling me now we're in a fantasy world, then I kind of want to know that first, beginning area there. Not I don't want to read 30 pages and suddenly it's like, no, we're in a fantasy medieval, China. Like, it's like, well, no, what just happened? I don't understand. So I think there is a bit of those promises. I think tone, I think content, to some degree. Content's maybe not the exact right word either, but just to separate a little bit from genre. I think I'd say content versus genre, but you could probably fill both in. Are there any other things you guys would add to that list as far as just?
Yeah, there's, I'm with Gaby, I'm pro prologue where it's needed. Sometimes it's not needed. Sometimes it's needed. But what's interesting is where this whole prologues are bad, and it won't get, you're the first reader, the agent will turn it down immediately if it's got a prologue. Well, it became kind of a cliche with fantasy, you know, they all had to have prologues, but where this whole rule,
Drink.
right, this whole rule originated, I remember reading, it was from an agent blog or a conversation reported between two agents, where one of them was just complaining about prologues and saying, if I read one more bad fantasy prologue, I'll scream. And suddenly, you know, the internet is all an echo chamber and it's all black and white. Suddenly it became this rule. And that wasn't the idea. You know, I don't think a prologue is going to sink your chances with an agent or publisher if it's a good prologue and it's needed.
Right.
You know, it's just nonsense. There's nothing wrong with them. It's just another tool. It's like, you know, exclamation marks are not going to sink your book.
Right.
You've got quite a few of them in the span of a few pages if people are really angry and screaming at one another. I mean, if someone screams at someone, there's got to be an exclamation mark at the end of it. Period ain't going to work.
Right. Yeah. You'll hear that too. It's like, oh, the dialogue should express it so perfectly. But it's like, you know, there are all these tools we have for a reason, right? The italics, whatever it might be. Like you need to use use a hammer when you need a hammer. Use a drill when you need a drill. I don't think it's any more mysterious than that. Like you need to figure out what tool works for that.
Epilogues are sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Epilogues are another one. You know, prologue and an epilogue. They're kind of, I think of them as bookends. You know, and you can have one on just one end. But there's something outside the immediate scope of your tale.
Yeah, and they can be really great for if you want to set the tone of something, right? You can set that tone, and then maybe the next thing you want to get them into is more of the thinking sci-fi kind of fantasy, probably especially. But I think fantasy and that they probably do a lot of prologues because they're trying to set that tone. This is kind of tonally what it's going to be. Here's the thing. I think it was the Wheel of Time. It starts with like someone, you would go insane when you use the magic too much. And so the prologue starts with someone going insane, and that you see them going insane. And then it starts with where the quest is, that first chapter. And then that first chapter, like, oh, if they're using magic, well, they might end up like that person. So that becomes that looming thing, that ominous shadow lurking behind the whole thing. And then you read on as they go on that quest and realize that's what they could be heading towards, that exact thing you started reading. So, if it's just, I don't think you should do anything just to do it, right? Like everything you do there should be some purpose behind it.
Right.
And I think a lot of times it's better to find that purpose after the fact, right? Like let your subconscious lead you, and then after the fact, look at it. And that's when you need to be able, I think, internalize everything. And then when you're editing and stuff and you're getting into it, then that's when you kind of externalize and go, okay, that's why I was doing that. Okay, that makes sense. Or, oh, now that I wrote this on page 200, this needs, this doesn't make as much sense as it did. And then now you can kind of adjust. So anything else before we move on to the next question? That was just the prologue. That was
I will say, and you touched on this talking about fantasy build. Prologues are often used to convey backstory. It's kind of covert way of conveying some backstory, but it can do a lot of things. And setting tone is certainly one, and expectations. There's so much they can be useful for. And as you say, sometimes you do things without knowing why. So you may write a prologue to your book because writers develop reflexes, and some of us are more intuitive, some of us are more intentional, and we plan more. But you develop reflexes, and you just know when a book needs a prologue at a certain point.
Sure. Well, and it might even just be a great writing exercise, right? I've heard of people say like, oh, I take the characters and I write a little monologue, from their point of view. That's not meant to be in the book, but it helps me find their voice. I did it with Pirates of Appalachia. I had the prologue. It's because there's kind of two worlds colliding. There's this the hills of West Virginia, it isn't technically West Virginia anymore, but there's the Appalachian hillside that's kind of magical and fantastical on its own. And then there's the hyper caffeinated hyper reality of the city and, Pittsburgh after the fact. So it's like, I wanted to set that pastoral area with the fantasy and the silly mystery and the satire of it, the silliness of it, the absurdity of it, because it's an absurd satire. And then the next chapter 1, becomes the political debate that's going on in the city, and that they're going nuts. And so I had wanted to kind of just juxtapose those just to start it. And it made more sense to kind of let that be a little bit in the boy, it's a mom telling the boy the story. That boy ends up becoming the pirate captain that sails to, sack Pittsburgh. So it's like it worked to kind of set that tone, and also to kind of look that there's this world, these worlds coexisting very close to each other that are very separate at the same time. So I think
having had a sneak peek at your prologue to Pirates of Appalachia, I think it works extraordinarily well.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Worked for me.
Very good. Hopefully it'll work for more people once it's out seeing the world here. Round 2. So super excited to do this because I have wonderful editors in my midst here. And I have no idea how you guys do it, because I could not. I would just be like, it's fine. Do it how you want. So how do you vet editors to find the right one for you and your work? So I think that maybe the work could be separate. Maybe it goes work by work, maybe not, whatever you guys think. But so I wanted to start, and then a bit just to kind of pull back the curtain. I need a pull back the curtain effect for this show, because I like to pull back the curtain so much. Of how I met both of you was that when I'd written a novel called The Hordes of Torment at the time, about a lady that was a compulsive hoarder, and this kind of single father that was having problems and got thrust into trying to help her, and all the tension that created. And I published that, and I'm just going to say the name now, with a publishing house called Black Mountain Press. Not recommended, but I published it. I think they had problems. I've actually talked with multiple other authors. They all had horrible experiences with them. I'm not sure if they're even still a press or not. But after a couple of years where, they stopped sending royalty checks, I at least got a few. Some of the other authors never got any. But after a couple of years, I was like, you know what, can I just get the rights back to it? And we'll call everything a day, whatever, royalties. I'm not even too worried about it, because I'm not sure it was nothing that was going to, change lifestyles or something, right? So I was like, can I just get the rights back to it? I always make this story sound way more amicable, and like I was less threatening than I was at the time. But here we are, they gave me rights back to it. And I struggled wanting to re-release it, but I was like, I spent all this work on this. I think there is a story there I want to tell. I'm going to edit this, and I just want to make this story the best it can be. So I edited myself. Literally with their physical art copy that they had sent me, I went through and edited and put those in. And I was like, okay, they didn't copy edit it. That was the thing that hurt my heart the most, that on the first page, there was a quotation mark, aggressive quotes, so everyone drink. There's a quotation mark facing the wrong way. And it had been there since I'd started writing it. It's just that, you miss those things as a writer pretty often. But once it was the physical form, I saw it right away. Like the first second I saw it, I'm like, oh, that quotation. And I looked, and I'm like, oh man, it's been there wrong the whole time. And so I was like, okay, I need someone at very minimal to copy edit this, but kind of look at it. And so I did a bunch of research, and I found Gaby. And then at that time you weren't, I forget, and you can clarify, but I forget. I don't think you were taking new clients at the time, or just kind of, busy with whatever you were doing. But you passed me along to Dario, saying, I think you would be a good fit with Dario. And then it turned out to be a wonderful fit, and especially because when I looked up Dario and saw, I think he changed the name of the book at some point. but you have the writing guide. And at one point it was like the Rebel Author's Guide. I think it used to be like Kill the Cat or something. It was the Rebel Author's Guide. But it was like, oh, that rebel author part fits me very well. Like I'm not into this like writing rules, or this particular way. It's like I'm always trying to find my own way. Every story I tell, I'm trying to find my own way to work my way through it. So it ended up being a little happenstance, but it ended up working really great. And then there was a bit of like research and things, but kind of bounced around and, talked with people and things worked out and we become great friends. And then after that, I was doing some silly thing and I was like, oh, Gaby's out that way. You can, hide your turtle, I forget the monster. I forget the little lake. It's supposed to be the monster of it in Indiana. And you helped me do that. And then we've had you both on the show and we're doing this now. So a long-winded way of saying I appreciate you both. I'm very happy how things have ended up. What are you guys' thoughts for writers? Especially, any stage of their career, especially I would think kind of newer and people more in the beginning end. How do you choose the correct editor? How do you vet them out? Where do you go from there? So you guys give me any thoughts you have. Maybe Gaby, we start with you and then we'll go over to Dario. Just like how I can't think of the word cirticulous. What's the circular path? That got
circuitous.
Circuitous. Thank you. That got me to Dario in the first place. So Gaby, you want to take us from there?
Sure. So I met Dario 7 years ago, according to Facebook. And I was refreshed to hear his attitude about writing and actually his approach to editing, which was just do what you're good at, keep going, keep practicing. Don't let all the rules frighten you and force you into a certain mold. Like just do what you feel is the best style for your writing, and then see if you want to work with it. So I was refreshed to hear that because I was in this writer's critique group at the time where we had these very important rules, like you have to hook them within the first 5 pages and you have to start with action and you have to do this and you have to do that. And so I was learning all this stuff, but I tend to write more character-driven stuff, and there's a lot of internal conflict. So it's not, always a karate fight in the first page, or a card chase. So
or both, a karate fight on top of the car chase.
So that was my introduction to Dario. And I think I've done mostly corporate editing, and there's really not a lot of, from my perspective, it's really just what's the style? What's the style guide? Do you use the Merriam-Webster dictionary, for example, when you're not sure of a spelling or if there's a hyphen or not? And then it's really a preference of the team. And so what happened to me at my last editing job was I was hired by someone who immediately quit. And then I was taken under the wing of the big manager. He gave me some very brief training and then he got fired. I met my boss, who was awesome. And we totally hit it off. The first time we had a meeting, there was like a guitar and a ukulele on the wall behind him. So we were instant friends. I had to, we had to compare notes about the music we play. And we're same age, both Gen X, bonding over that. And then he lost his job. A new manager came in, and some of the team were not happy with what I had been trained on. They had moved on from that style, but they never told me. So I was, and I lost my job because of that. So, just a weird little vignette about the corporate world.
Right.
If you're looking for someone to work on your fiction, I think you need to people and kind of get a feel for how they're going to react to your work. Maybe show them a little bit of your work. One of the things I do if I'm going to edit something, if I'm auditioning for a job, basically, no matter what kind, is I will get 5 pages, 4 pages, and I'll say, let me show you what I would do with this material. So that person would hand you their work or 4 pages of it, and you would turn it back over to them after you look through it. Some of it is content, maybe a question like, what is this referring to? Don't you need to write this out? Is this chapter 2, or do we all know what this acronym means, or, whatever. Plus the grammar, spelling, punctuation, things like that. So I think the audition process is important because that way both sides know what they're getting. Now, I've seen this abused in the Upwork scene. I've literally met people who are like, oh, would you, I'm looking for an editor. Would you do this, chapter of my book? It turns out it's not a very long book. And she's probably asking 10 people to do 10 different chapters. And she's probably not going to pick one. So, you have to, take that with a grain of salt. But
Sure.
But that's kind
of the things not to do. Have 10 different people edit 10 different chapters so that they're all like,
God, oh my God, what a nightmare.
Asking me to do more work, and finally I told her I had another job even though I didn't. It's just like, oh dear, I can't help you anymore. Good luck.
Right. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. That actually reminded me when I was looking, because it's been so long now, but I remember there was quite a few people would do like a few pages, right? And I didn't ask. It was, if Dario said he would do 3 pages, I'd have him do 3 pages. And I remember there was one gentleman that was a story. And Dario, you'll know this one. The one of the book I'm currently writing now is it's the first chapter to it. It's called Teeth, and it's 1,000 words. It's the guy's kind of just vengeance personified, right? He's just very mad. He's very emotional. And so it's very clipped. It's very straightforward, or just heartbroken and just through, right? And then so he's adding that, and I'm like, and so he did it for like a page, and then he's like, oh, I'm also a ghostwriter if you need some ghostwriting, and I'm like, none of this works. I don't need you to ghostwrite. Like I just wouldn't write anything if I needed a ghostwriter. Like that's silliness. For me, right? I'm not a celebrity, right? I'm not my celebrity memoir here. Like, and then it was just what he did. I was like, oh, okay, no, this guy is a no-go. So I think sometimes that does help getting a few pages and then kind of seeing what they think, getting some questions. So I think that kind of audition is an important step. So, sorry, did you start to say something, or you want to take it from there?
Sure. My problem is not giving a 2-hour lecture on this topic. Gaby used the word fit, I think, and fit is critical both ways for the writer and the editor. So the first thing I'm going to say is, since it's so damn difficult to make any kind of a living, even beer money as a writer, maybe one writer out of every 2 or 3 is now selling themselves as an editor, and many of them are not necessarily very skilled at it. You really need, the fit needs to be good in every way. It needs to be a genre or category that the editor reads and knows the rules of. They need to be good at their craft. They need to have a connection with the author. I do a 2,500 word free sample, and I insist on seeing the whole manuscript. I'll only do the sample on the beginning. And I insist on seeing the whole manuscript because I want to get an idea of how consistent the self-editing and revision is throughout the manuscript. Often people have super polished the first 2 or 3 chapters and then the rest is junk. So that matters when it comes to pricing. I think you should get a free sample with your editor. If possible, you should talk to them on the phone or have a Zoom call once you see if the sample works for you. And I turned down a fair number of jobs. If the person is someone who really isn't when you're working with indies a lot, which I do, I mean, I do have the occasional trad pub writer who comes to me for a pre-edit, because as you said, a lot of publishers, even some of the big ones, won't give you good copy editing anymore. I have some traditionally published authors who come to me for copy editing before they sell a book to the publisher. But with indies especially, some of them just aren't ready for editing. They think they're ready, but they're not there. And I'm not going to just take someone's money if their work is, I'm going to be harsh here, if their work is trash or is really just not ready for an audience. I might give them some feedback. So I think that's really important. I think you have to have integrity. You have to be honest with the person. I think another problem with a lot of editors is that they don't deliver on time. Graphic artists are even worse on this. People are flaky. And I've got a ton of testimonials on my site for that reason. Every other author I do a job for, I try and get a testimonial, because to me, when someone is paying you good money to do a job, they deserve a very good job. They deserve your best. And you don't promise them dates you can't hold up to. You don't let your personal life get in the way of delivering a job. And the biggest complaints I hear, I've had clients come to me who have been to 3 other editors, who have been to people that charge more than I do. And I'm kind of in the middle of the industry price range. And the complaints I hear most often are, they flaked, they didn't deliver on time, they really didn't give me a very good editor. It's a minefield. One of the things I will say, because I'm assuming a lot of your viewers here are thinking of hiring an editor, I'll say 2 things. One, everyone needs editing. Even the best manuscripts I get, I can usually find 8 to 10 errors per page. And I've spoken to other professionals, and that's pretty much a good metric, So granted, a lot of them are commas or capitalization errors, but readers only put up with so much, and
Sure.
and there are a lot of books,
and that's a lot
websites.
when you add it up, right?
Oh my God, 1,500
over 300 pages or whatever it might be.
1,500, 2,000 track changes and maybe 100 comments, which are actionable items, are about average for me. Readers going to put down a book at a certain point if it's too bad. Readers they love indie. They don't mind. They don't care if you're an indie or trad pub author, but they want some quality. So you can't self-edit. There are a lot of books on it. There's a lot of websites on it. You can do some things, but you're too close to your own material. And anyone who says you can really self-edit well is
oh, sure. Well, I told the story of that quotation mark facing the wrong way.
Oh, yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
And you can, I think when I send them to you, it's usually pretty as clean as it can be, right? I think you can disagree with me. I think you've told me that usually when I send it to you, it's usually as good as I can get it, right? It's usually not quotation marks everywhere, slop, but it's, no matter what you're doing, it's hard, and you can go backwards, forwards, whatever way you want. It's still your work. You still start to read it and know what it's meant to say there. Your brain kind of knows where it's going, and fills in those things that might be wrong.
Well, and you won't miss the logic.
I'm sorry, Gaby, you didn't come through, Gaby.
I said your brain fills in words that aren't there.
Absolutely. Yeah,
right.
all the time I'll find no the there, right?
Yeah, you don't see it.
Well, also you won't notice the logical holes and the plot errors and things like that. You won't notice if you're giving too much or too little information. Information management is huge, especially in science fiction and fantasy. All those things need an outside reader, and they better be good. So, your editing is, Bill, you mentioned earlier on that you thought it was a difficult thing to do. I once had a client offer to edit, a good client who I'd worked with a lot, offered to edit a job for a friend of his, and he sent me an email a few weeks after saying that was the hardest thing I've ever done. You've got to kind of float along a lot of levels, depending what kind of editing you're doing. There's people talk about copy editing, developmental editing, line editing. I mean, there are differences, but there's also a lot of overlap. So, yeah, I'm looking for reversed quotation marks and punctuation errors, and punctuation errors are probably 30% of the corrections. But I'm also looking for characters, eye color changing, their setting changing, for logical plot errors, things that you can't do. The best manuscript I ever worked with in terms of errors was from a professional who was a science fiction writer, but also wrote mysteries. He was very, very good. And this book, in 70 or 80,000 words, only came up with a few score edits, 20 or 30 track changes. But at the end of it, there was a complete doozy. At the end of it, at the climax, the hero who had to disarm a villain grabs the villain's gun, but he's already got two things in his hands. That's just classic, he didn't see it. He didn't see it. I earned my fee right there.
Right, amen. What are the differences? So for people, maybe doing this for the first time. So you say, I mean, copy edit, I think is fairly straightforward, right? You're catching typos and things. But there's developmental edits. There's the copy edit plus kind of deal, right? Where you go through, but also catch things like that, like this logical errors, things like that. Maybe could you, maybe explain what those differences might be?
So it's hard to stay in one lane when you're editing, because once in a while, it's not Rose, it's Ruth. You know what I mean? Like it starts off with one name and then it goes to another, and you're like, is this the lady from chapter 2?
Mm-hmm.
So even if you're just there for spelling and punctuation and grammar, you do notice other things. And so I feel like mostly copy editing really is copy editing plus, because you don't want them to tell the story with like needing 3 hands for the climactic scene, or
It suddenly becomes an octopus right when needed. What does that do exact octopus?
Gaby, what do you think the most? Are we going to, Bill? Are we going to talk about common faults, the most common things we pick up? Is that part of this?
That's going to be the next question. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Sorry, go on, Gaby. Interrupted.
So the question was, what was the question?
So for that, what the differences between edits. So when we say, I'm looking for an editor, am I looking for kind of that copyright plus, right? I want you to kind of capture my typos and then obvious logical, errors, name changes, things like that. Versus like, and maybe there's another term, the other one that jumps to my mind, and I would think of them very differently myself as an author, that's never trying to be an editor. Is the developmental edit, right? To whereas I could see like, okay, I'm maybe it's still the first draft, but I need someone to help me figure out the story, right? You know what I mean? Like I need a lot more than copy edit plus. I need structural things versus tapestry.
Not done that, and so I'm not a good person to ask. I kind of bow out of that. I my old to say when I did this work more often, it wasn't, not obviously not corporate stuff that's not going to have a plot, but what I used to say was I have to trust the client to have their story, and then I'm the one that kind of polishes it. But I'm not, Dario could probably weigh in on that a lot more than I could.
You want to take it then from Dario?
So yeah, developmental editing, also known as structural editing, is really it's structural. That's the best word for it. So, you know, even if the manuscript is finished and you don't need to know, you know, how to develop it, I mean, that can be part of it. You know, someone can have a partly developed manuscript, but it's often to do with needing to restructure, move scenes, delete scenes, you know, give a certain character a bigger part. It's huge. And I don't consider myself a terribly good developmental editor, but I've worked with a couple of people who've been very happy. Because I'm a pantser as a writer, I'm not a plotter. So that kind of, you know, that kind of disqualifies me from developmental editing. However, I will help, and sometimes I do it. Copy editing is a really broad church. I take it as copy editing plus. So to me, it's everything. People, let's face it, you know, spell check, people who use spell checker, you know, you're not left with many typos, but you are left with a lot of words where you meant to write another word, TWO instead of TOO, or, you know, expect instead of aspect, or there's millions of them. Spell checkers won't pick those up. So at the lowest level, you've got those, you've got, you know, commas and typos, and but a copy editor should also notice some bigger picture things, you know, characters' eyes or names changing, that kind of thing. And I do take it a bit further. If I see major plot inconsistencies or obvious developmental work that needs to happen, I'll usually include that. So it's a bigger picture. Line editing is really to do, it's more of a granular edit where you're looking at whether a line of dialogue works, whether it's in character, whether, you know, some of the prose is really working, you know, it's tinkering with prose and dialogue. And sometimes I'll do some of that. If I see, you know, if I see a character, a chunk of character dialogue that really doesn't sound like that character, I'll offer some suggestions to rewrite it. So I take a real big picture view of copy editing, but there's a lot of overlap.
Sure, that makes sense. Thanks for that. I even forgot the whole line edit, you know, portion of it. So thanks for that. So then maybe we just move to what are like the common mistakes you see when, you know, when you get, I think what the email I sent, I said the 3 most common, but whatever number of common you want to say, but what are the most common mistakes you see with a submitted manuscript?
Shall I begin or? Okay.
Sure.
I actually made a note on this. Let me count the ways. There are so many. Oh, there are so many. Probably 50% of any edit I do is punctuation, capitalization errors, and people using numerals where they should be spelling out numbers. Bottom shelf stuff, you know, buy yourself a copy of the Chicago Manual of Style and learn it. Capitalization errors are big, and in fantasy especially, you know, there's a fantasy trope known as significant capitalization, where people capitalize every other word, you know. So those things are important. But on a you know, middle and top shelf level, so the first thing I notice is I often feel I'm too detached from the story, and I'm the person. I feel like I'm looking at the story through a camera lens, and I often suggest to authors, and this is kind of semi-developmental. I often suggest to an author that they need more internal dialogue. and I've talked about this on your show before, internal dialogue is incredibly powerful, incredibly powerful. You don't have to dramatize every scene, but internal dialogue can develop character, it can reveal backstory, it can, more important, it gives you, when you force the reader into the character's head, it gives you their judgment and their attitude and reveals so much about them. It's the most powerful tool. And I find a lot of authors rely too much on dramatizing a scene, but they remain external. So I feel like I'm just looking at it through.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, I mentioned it earlier, this show, the Hollywoodization of it, right?
Yeah.
It's like we think of it through movies and it's like, no, this is a book. Use the tools you have as a book. Don't think you're just a director with a camera. You can get into smells, right? Like you can get whole senses you can use here. Taste, everything you can actually articulate in different ways versus, that camera lens.
And emotional reactions.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Physiological ones too. Right. I mean, just the heartbeat kind of going up, and, and maybe you can allude to those with a movie, the heartbeat, sound effect or something like that. But there's pros and cons, but there's also limitations to both. So if you limit yourself to what you can show in a movie, in a book, you really just took away a lot of your tool set, to what reason, I'm not sure. Maybe you have one, but you better have a good one to throw away that much techniques and methods you can employ.
Yeah. Again, it's a tool, but to me it's the strongest tool a writer has, as well as voice. The other thing, this is a weird one. I correct past perfect errors a lot. So past perfect, he had gone out that morning, as opposed to simple past, he went out that morning. Problem with past perfect is that people don't know how to use it. So if something is in the story past, so, okay, let's say we're telling a story in the past tense. Okay, we use, he went out that morning. But you want to shift into the story past. So, the character is walking down the street today, but then you want to talk about something that happened to the character yesterday. So some authors will go, he had visited his aunt. The butler had opened the door. He had entered the house and the butler had shown him into the living room. His aunt had come down the stairs. No, it's clunky, it's awkward.
Right.
With past perfect, it's like a gear shift knob. You use it once at the beginning of the shift into the story past. So he had gone to visit his aunt yesterday. The butler opened the door and showed him into the living room. He sat down and his aunt came down the stairs. Once you've moved into the story past, the relative past, you don't need to use past perfect anymore. You shift back into the story present, well, that was yesterday, he thought. Mm-hmm. And then you go on, and next time you move into the story past, you use the past perfect, the had, once, and then you carry on. This is, it's not a huge sin, but even the best writers do it, and it's clunky and awkward. Sure. So that's my number 2. I think I'll write a small monogram on that. Number 3 is minor viewpoint slips, sometimes major viewpoint slips. We all know this. If you're writing third-person limited omniscient, you can only switch viewpoints at a scene break or a chapter break. But often you'll find the viewpoint character, you'll find the narrator telling us the viewpoint character's eyes widened. Well, the viewpoint character doesn't see their eyes widening. It's minor, but it breaks the fictional dream a little bit. Mm-hmm. I'm a hound on viewpoint. I think it's really important to establish that up front at the beginning of a scene. And it's like setting. The reader needs to be solidly anchored. A reader who isn't solidly anchored isn't giving your story the best attention.
Right. Sure. I've noticed that when I read, and then someone jumps viewpoints a lot in one scene, I struggle to kind of keep up with who, you know what I mean? Like, whose head am I in? Like, you feel like you're popping through. And I think they tend to be misguided, because sometimes what's really interesting is to see that character's reaction from a different point of view. Right. So sometimes I look at it and go, oh, when pirates, it jumps viewpoints. Well, sometimes it's really fun to do a scene that maybe it's actually bigger for this character, but someone else is watching them and doesn't get to know exactly what they're saying, but we get to look, and you get a different viewpoint and what other characters think about them. So it can, those limitations, those boxes, hypothetical boxes we like to build for ourselves, right? The floor is lava, whatever it might be, can actually lead to some really creative ways to do it, and can reveal a lot more, because I don't know everything about me, right? Like, we think we know, like, but we're always changing. We're emotional. Like, we might be completely irrational about something that's happening and not realize that someone else may realize and actually have a better input on it. So, but I see that sometimes, especially indie books, you'll see it, and the people are just bouncing, and I'm like, I don't know what's happening. I'm not sure why it needed to happen, and I've kind of it's like Tinkerbell going in everyone's ear, and then I don't even know where you end up.
Yeah. Well, the bottom line is, I'll say I'm strict on this stuff, but the bottom line is, you're God in your books. If you have good enough craft and you can get away with it, do it. And some of the best authors will break viewpoint. They'll go into, I've said before, Stephen King does this. Sometimes he'll go omniscient into narrative authorial observation and then come back into the viewpoint. If you can get away with it, do it.
Sure. It's that ineffable, if it works, right? You just got to figure out if it works.
That, and that's why, rebel writer. And then, just to very quickly conclude, two very minor things that I notice a lot of people using too many speech tags. If there's two people in a scene, you pretty much know who's talking, especially if the dialogue's distinct. If you need to throw a speech tag in, do it every 4 exchanges, not every line. Or people not using enough speech tags where there's multi-person dialogue. And choppiness is a thing that irritates me. I mean, I'm kind of a, as we said earlier, I'm a bit of a style junkie. I like stylists. I find a lot of modern writing, especially genre fiction, tends to very choppy prose, short sentences, insufficient punctuation, people only using commas and periods. Well, there's really a place for colons and semicolons. There's a place where you want longer sentences with, multiple dependent clauses. Rhythm is really important in prose. And sometimes, sometimes I say to people, this feels choppy. Give us some long paragraphs, some more complex sentences,
Right. And sometimes just varying them, right? If you do the ABC, 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 it get a little boring, right? Like, you see it in poetry a lot, right? It'll be that, like, is A, B, A, B, A, B, but then you break it. And that break is actually really illuminating to what happened and catches your attention. The same thing in writing. I think one of my greatest skills as a writer is actually that I'm bored easily. So I will go like, oh, I'm just bored writing it this way, and like I'll shift. But I think the reader can be feeling that too. It's like, oh, okay, I've kind of gotten into this, and now I've kind of lost track, right? It's that I'm watching the show and it just keeps doing the same thing. Well, now my mind's wandered and I'm looking at my phone, or daydreaming because it's lost my attention. You can do the same thing, reading. So.
Yeah, very much. I mean, if it's boring you, it's probably going to bore the reader. That's
absolutely
almost a cardinal rule right there.
Absolutely. So, maybe you want to add anything?
Yeah, the things that I find mostly when I'm giving critiques or working with somebody is point of view shift. And I'm obnoxious by this point. I've been doing this a while. I'll be like, oh, so we're in so and so's brain. Oh, so we're back, and
Okay.
like and the bit that Dario pointed out, like you can't feel you can feel your face contort, but you can't see what it looks like. You know what I mean? And so if
Nice.
you're going to have a point of view of like, I felt myself cringe sounds different than I cringed, or I, I'm not coming up with the best example, um, but right, like I felt myself blush is different than I blushed because I can't, unless there's a mirror there, I can't see myself. And so if you're the point of view character, you need to keep that in mind when the reader is experiencing things through your eyes and hopefully not hopping around to everyone else in the scene. Another thing that I've noticed in writing is sometimes people just can't pick a verb tense. so
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
So, it's cool if you can pick one or the other and it makes sense. But then for the reader, it's like, oh, so we're back to present tense. Oh, so why, like I would get it if that was a flashback, but no, it's just a continuation of the situation that you described. So I would look at that. If you're a writer that wants to submit something or have someone look at it, make sure that you're not going to confuse them with those two things. And also, I wanted to mention before in the editor conversation, sometimes I find that people like to write about very controversial topics. And I've been approached to work on things that I have no interest in reading.
Sure.
And you have to understand that. If
Right.
you have very strong feelings about important social issues, you need to find someone that fits that bill, that's not going to be like,
Right.
oh,
Right.
trying to take my freedoms away, or
Right.
whatever the case may be. So I find that, especially with people in the earlier phases of writing, like their agenda shows a bit more. Like, this is what I want to say, and I'm going to say it. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And this is how I feel about such a thing, and I'm gonna make all these characters who are basically like me, and they're gonna talk about it.
Right. Well, yeah, you see that, and I think the beginning phases is certainly it. Is that if you want to write about, let's say, gun control in America, right? Controversial topic, you'll get people that are like, I want 1,000 guns. People like, no one should ever have any guns, right? And the people get very heated about it. If you want to talk gun control, you talk it through the story, right? If you want to like explore that idea, explore it through the story, through like, and explore both sides. Have characters that think about it through both sides. The best example I can always think of, and it's a TV show, but Modern Family. I don't know if you guys ever watched it, but Modern Family is supposed to be about these modern families. And it's like the dad has the two kids, right? And then he ends up getting divorced from the mom. He remarries with the younger woman who's Colombian. And then now he has a stepkid, and they end up having another kid. So that's the modern part. Then one of the sons is gay. So they're a gay couple. They end up adopting a kid. It's the first episode, so that's not spoilers, right? What happens. And the other one's the daughter's the more traditional, family, the 2-parent home, the kids. And it explores that. And they showed that through that show, because it got really popular. It's really hilarious. They do a really great job with it. But the dad is a little uncomfortable with the son being gay. But they don't make him into a villain for it, right? And they also don't make the son, Mitchell and Cam, or the characters' names, they don't make them saints either. They're not always right. They do dumb things and silly things, and And so it kind of explores it through both things, and then they come together, and then love the grandkid, and and the family comes together. So they showed polling from when that show started and it got super popular, that American ideas on gay marriage changed, because gay marriage when that show started wasn't legal. The Supreme Court hadn't legalized it, right? And they showed like the polling that how Americans' attitudes had changed to where they were okay with it. Like it went from mostly negative, it was 40% or something that was for it. And then after the show it was like 60. And then it was a huge, huge hit for ABC back in the day. It still does tons of streaming. But it just showed them as a couple. It just showed them as flawed people that loved each other and were trying to raise a kid, trying to do the best they can. Had their own, they would, one of the conceits of the thing would always be anytime someone felt very high and mighty, they would not be high and mighty, right? They would get it pulled out from under them. So it did that all the time. And so when the big guy kissed the red guy, became a big thing, because Cam was a bigger guy. He used to be a football player, right? And then the other guys are redhead. And that became a thing, like, oh, the big guy kissed the red guy. And then everyone was okay with it, and it was fine. That did way more than if you just preached to someone about gay rights or whatever, the different things would come up. So I think if you explore it through story, explore it through real characters, right? And not mythologized, saintly characters, through real people, and not real people because they're characters, but that could be real, that you can actually relate to. That will change hearts. But you'll see people like, I just want to write this to tell people off, right? Like an angry tweet,
we all
they
want
spent
to
300
do
pages.
that.
Right.
We all want to do it, but nobody wants to hear it. Yeah, nobody
Right.
wants to be preached at.
Right. Yeah, you're not turning anyone to your side, that way, right? So if your idea is to change minds or to show a new point of view, just going into your, I want to make America great again, and then preaching, like, why spend 300 words to do that? Go send a tweet, buddy. Like, that's gonna have just as much people view it, and it's probably going to be 0. I mean, that's and or 100, whatever it is. But there's no reason to use a story form to do it, unless you're going to actually use the story form and use the characters for what they're really meant for. So getting back to the editing, is there any, so I don't know that I have any follow-up questions beyond what we did. Was there any parting thoughts you guys wanted as far as, I guess, finding an editor, common mistakes, anything along those lines?
I think one needs to be compassionate. I think both Gaby and I have an added advantage in that we're both writers. And I think having an editor who's a writer is a huge plus, because they get where you're coming from, they understand your process. I'll praise some of my comments in a manuscript. If I see something that's really working well, I'll praise it and talk about it a bit. That's important.
Absolutely.
I think you have to be compassionate and supportive and feel for what the writer's going through, because it's being edited, apart from the fact that you're spending good money, which you could spend on something much more fun, is it's scary. Someone's redlining your work. I will say that one of my greatest joys is when my client's a PhD and I get to redline their work, but that's another thing. But I think you have to feel what they're going through, and you have to be supportive. You kind of have to be an advocate and a counselor, as well as because a lot of what you're giving them is tough to hear.
Sure. Well, and I think as a writer, I think it's important too, is that and I don't remember, Dario, if you were on that episode. We did have an episode where I talked about handling criticism. And it's hard; these all blend in, into my head. But there is an importance to how you handle criticism. And one is handling it as an adult, as a professional, right? If you want to do this professionally, treat it professionally. You're going to show up, you're going to sign up to do an episode of Writers Drinking Whiskey Open Bar. Show up, just like no show. That's not professional. But but there's the handling, like, okay, you said I should do this. Why did you maybe think that? Okay, maybe that makes sense. Maybe it doesn't, right? None of us have the answer all of the time. So maybe there's a third thing, right? So if I get criticism, I don't like, so I think our natural reaction is to deflect it, right? But you have to like take that natural inclination and then go, wait, okay, does this make sense? Okay, and some of it's super easy, right? Typos, things like that. Okay, like you shouldn't be stressing yourself on that. Like, does it make sense or not? Just get it done. But if it's content related, like take it and go, okay, wait, does it make sense? Okay, is there anything else I can do? Because what might happen is that a lot of times those conflicts can actually lead us to something even like unexpected, even more beautiful. You might find more truth in that fact that, okay, I thought this, now Dario's hitting me back on that. Well, there's actually this third path I didn't think of. And this actually reveals more truth than the other way, or the way he said. So I think handling criticism, handling feedback is really, really vital for the author. So I think that goes both ways. I think for an editor, be kind. You go kill someone, you're likely not to get a good response, right? Just like my corporate career is winding down, but when I would have to give people feedback, if I gave them too harsh a feedback, well, they didn't hear it, right? So if I went too hard on them, well, they would never hear it. So it didn't behoove me for what I wanted, or them for me to go, you're just doing a horrible job, and you did this, and here's a list of 30 different things you've done wrong, versus, hey, this is what's going on, this is what I'm thinking, what do you think? That you can actually get past that initial reaction. So
you have to care. You
do. You have to have compassion, empathy, whatever you do, and that'll get you way farther. I think it's both ends. I think speaking for the writers for a second, you guys are too, but you have to know your editors are trying to do the best they can too. They can't, your bosses, whoever's generally not like megalomaniac, right? I mean, not villains. We're all protagonists and antagonists. Like there's probably horror. There's Putin out there, right? It's gonna go
we're
wage
all
war,
heroes in our story.
Yeah, exactly. That's that.
Someone else's too, right?
I missed it. What did you say?
All antagonists in someone else's story too.
Right.
To say something, Bill. I really like what you said about Modern Family. I think that really kind of shows people what show means. Instead of telling us how you feel about a issue, show us how this and maybe win a few hearts and minds along the way. That's one of the harder things to explain to someone as an editor is you're telling too much and you need to show us more. You need to get us to care, like kind of what Dario said about the emotional connection to the story. It's just as important as an action type hook, or knowing what the problem is or the question is right at the start. It's important for people to care. I mean, that's why we pick up books. We want to care about something. We want to get lost in someone else's story, right? And being a effective editor is something that can make sure that story gets told. And so hearing the feedback is A+ if you can. And I know it. I know I used to be a beginner, and I was so insulted the first time I got feedback. I was like 26. Like, who does she think she is? Once you learn how to, figure out what's going to work for your story, and once you understand that they're asking for this because it will make it better, then you kind of relax a little bit, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you're both on the same side.
Right. Yeah. And that's the hard thing to realize, right? You gotta take your ego out of it. Ego ends up being ego can be a detriment unless you get it working for you. So if you put your ego on, my ego is making the best product possible, right? Writing the very best story by hook or by crook. I just want this story to be the best it can be. And that's what my ego is. Your ego will work for you. If my ego is, I'm the greatest writer and I need to write, then yeah, it sabotages you, right? Because then it's like, oh, I can't take feedback because you're denting my ego. I'm so great, versus like, no, I'm trying to produce this thing, so it's hard, but yeah, if you get your ego working for you, it's great. If you get it working against you, it's going to undercut you. So it so often does, right? Like, I want to be a bestseller. That's actually not within your control, right? You can be the best writer you can be. And if that's what your goal is, and that's where your ego is being the best you can be and producing the best things you can, then you'll be happy. You'll grow, and you'll maybe be a bestseller one day. If it's your ego is all set on these accolades and all this stuff that's outside your control, then you're going to get undercut. You're going to have conflict with people, and it's going to be difficult from there. So, awesome. So any final thoughts?
No, I thought that was really interesting. And, every question kind of raises other questions, and I'm thinking of all kinds of things now. But no, that was wonderful. Thank you, Bill. And I want to tell, I want to take the opportunity to tell people to read your books, because you're a damn good writer.
Thank you for that. And I did pay Dario ahead of time for that. So
oh yes, yes. Well,
paid advertisement, YouTube, just so you're aware. No, but thank you. You can see I'm a West Virginia kid. I can't take any kind of praise. I'm like, no, just deflect. You see, I deflect. When people like me is when I deflect.
Your rate just went up.
Thank you for that, and thank both of you. I learned something every show, so it's been great having you both on, and we'll be on, I'm sure, again. So thanks so much for your time and all your input.
Thank you.
Thanks, viewers.
People to find. It doesn't have to be a friend, but it needs to be someone that you really trust. If you're looking for an editor, you need to have a good relationship, and if it's not clicking, keep moving, because they can do better and so can you. And if it's looking for a good fit, they'll understand, and you need to find the best thing for you as a writer.
Yeah, and that's a perfect epilogue to this episode, because we started off with like the Tinder, right? It's like kind of the dating, right? Like, you date and sometimes it's not the best fit. You move on. So very good. Awesome. Well, thanks for both of you. I will include links to all the websites and everything, for anyone looking. It'll all be in the description, down there, and aggressive air quotes. So everyone just keep drinking here to end the show.